The soft hum of Graham Stinson's truck echoed through the quiet streets of Somerset Valley as he pulled into his driveway. It was late, far later than usual, and exhaustion weighed heavily on his shoulders after another grueling day at the renovation site. Yet tonight felt different. As he stepped out of the truck, his eyes fell on an unfamiliar black car parked in front of his house, sleek and polished under the glow of the streetlight. The license plate, CM01, gleamed with an unsettling familiarity. Graham hesitated, his keys dangling in his hand. A knot formed in his stomach, tightening with each step toward the front door. Juliet's voice echoed faintly inside, soft and laughing, a sound he hadn't heard in a long time. It was the kind of laugh she used to save just for him, a laugh that now made his skin crawl. Pushing the door open, Graham was met with the smell of wine and candles, a rare luxury in their household. The dim light of the living room cast long shadows, revealing Juliet seated on the couch, her posture too relaxed, too inviting. Beside her sat Calvin Merritt, the town's notorious real estate mogul. His tailored suit was uncomfortably out of place in their modest home, but what caught Graham's attention most was their proximity, close enough to share a secret. "Graham!" Juliet exclaimed, standing abruptly, her eyes wide with something between guilt and surprise. Calvin merely leaned back, his smile thin, his confidence unsettling. "What's this?" Graham's voice was steady but strained, his gaze darting between Juliet and Calvin. He noticed the way her hand trembled as she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, a telltale sign of her nervousness. "Oh, Calvin just stopped by to, talk about the new development project," Juliet stammered, her words tumbling out too quickly. "He's helping me understand some financial things." Graham didn't respond immediately. Instead, he shifted his focus to the half-empty glasses of wine on the coffee table and Calvin's blazer, draped casually over the back of the couch. The scene felt staged, wrong, like an unfinished puzzle with missing pieces. "And you needed candlelight for that?" Graham asked, his tone cold, his eyes narrowing on Juliet. "It's not what it looks like," Juliet replied, her voice sharper now, almost defensive. But the look in her eyes betrayed her, a flicker of shame she couldn't hide. Calvin rose to his feet, smoothing his tie with calculated ease. "Graham, I think we got off on the wrong foot. I should probably head out." "You should have left before you stepped in," Graham interrupted, his voice low, dangerous. Calvin's composure faltered for the first time, and he raised his hands in mock surrender. "I'll see myself out," he muttered, grabbing his blazer and brushing past Graham. The sound of the door closing behind him left a deafening silence in its wake. Juliet stood frozen, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "You didn't have to be so rude," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Graham's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Rude? Juliet, there's a strange man sitting on our couch drinking wine with you and you think I'm rude?" "I told you it's not what it looks like," Juliet snapped, her frustration bubbling over. "You're always assuming the worst, always so quick to judge." Graham's anger flared, but beneath it there was something deeper, a heartbreak he couldn't yet put into words. He took a step closer, his voice trembling. "Then tell me what this is, Juliet. Explain why you're here with him instead of calling me. Why our kids are asleep upstairs and you're playing house with Calvin Merritt." Juliet looked away, unable to meet his eyes. For a moment, the only sound was the ticking of the wall clock, each second dragging out the silence between them. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, almost pleading. "Graham, save it." He cut her off, his voice breaking. He turned toward the stairs, his heart pounding as he took the first step. "We'll talk tomorrow. I need to see my kids." As Graham ascended, he felt the weight of the evening pressing down on him. He didn't need Juliet to say the words. The truth was already written in her eyes, in the way she had laughed with Calvin, in the way she hadn't fought to stop him from leaving. Something had broken in their home tonight, and Graham feared it was beyond repair. The sunlight crept through the blinds, casting golden streaks across the kitchen floor. Graham Stinson sat at the table, his hands wrapped tightly around a lukewarm mug of coffee. He hadn't slept. The events of the previous night played on an endless loop in his mind, each detail carving deeper into his chest. Calvin's smug smile, Juliet stammering excuses. They were pieces of a puzzle he couldn't ignore. Juliet entered the room, her hair pulled into a messy bun, her expression unreadable. "Morning," she said, avoiding his gaze as she reached for a glass. Graham didn't respond. He simply watched her move, his mind racing. The silence hung heavy in the room, thick with unspoken accusations and the weight of shattered trust. Finally he spoke, his voice low but firm. "We need to talk." Juliet froze for a fraction of a second before turning to face him, her glass clutched tightly in her hands. "About what?" "Don't do that," Graham said, his tone sharper now. "Don't pretend you don't know." She sighed, placing the glass on the counter with a soft clink. "Graham, I told you last night, it's not what you think." "Then tell me what it is." His voice rose, cutting through the morning stillness. "Tell me why Calvin Merritt was sitting on our couch, drinking wine with you, while our kids were asleep upstairs. Explain the candles, the laughter, the way you couldn't even look me in the eye." Juliet flinched at his words, but her defenses rose quickly. "You're overreacting," she snapped. "It was nothing. He stopped by to discuss a business opportunity, that's all." "A business opportunity?" Graham repeated, his disbelief evident. "Juliet, you've never cared about finances. You don't even check our bank statements without asking me. And now you're suddenly discussing deals with Calvin Merritt? At night? Alone?" Her cheeks flushed, and she crossed her arms tightly over her chest. "I don't have to justify myself to you." "Yes, you do," Graham shot back, slamming his hand on the table. The sound echoed, making Juliet jump. "You owe me the truth, Juliet. After everything we've been through, everything I've done to keep this family together, you owe me that much." For a moment she looked like she might say something, but then her expression hardened. "Fine. You want the truth? I needed someone to talk to, someone who doesn't make me feel invisible." The words hit Graham like a punch to the gut. Invisible. He leaned back in his chair, his heart pounding. "Is that what this is about?" he asked quietly. "You feel invisible, so you turn to him? To Calvin Merritt?" Juliet's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. "It wasn't supposed to mean anything," she whispered. "But you're always so busy, Graham. Always working, always tired. When was the last time you even looked at me? Really looked at me?" Graham stared at her, his mind reeling. He wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, but the truth lodged in his throat like a stone. He had been distant, consumed by work and the weight of their responsibilities. But that didn't excuse this, didn't justify what she had done. "I work myself to the bone for this family," he said, his voice trembling with anger and hurt. "I miss dinners, birthdays, milestones, all for you and the kids, and this is how you repay me? By letting that man into our home? By letting him sit where I sit, drink with my wife, and—" "It didn't go that far," Juliet interrupted, her voice cracking. "It was one night, Graham. One stupid night. One night too many," he replied, his eyes burning into hers. "Tell me the truth, Juliet. Was it just last night? Or has this been going on longer?" She hesitated, and in that pause, Graham found his answer. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "I can't do this," he said, his voice hollow. "Not now." "Graham, wait," she pleaded, reaching for him, but he stepped back. The sight of her hand, trembling and desperate, only deepened the ache in his chest. "I'll be back later," he said, his tone flat. "I need time to think." As he walked out the door, the cool morning air hit his face, but it did little to soothe the storm raging inside him. The woman he had built his life around, the mother of his children, had betrayed him in a way he couldn't yet fully comprehend. And the worst part? He wasn't sure if he could ever forgive her or himself. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows of Graham's workshop, casting long shadows over the tools and wood scattered across the workbench. He had come here to clear his mind, but the ache in his chest wouldn't subside. Every image of Juliet sitting with Calvin replayed endlessly, each one adding to his growing suspicion. He needed clarity, something concrete, not just the hollow words she'd offered him last night. Graham reached for his phone, his hand hesitating mid-air. He hated the thought of invading her privacy, but doubt had already taken root. Was he being paranoid? Or had Juliet betrayed him in ways he couldn't yet fathom? His fingers tightened around the device as he navigated to the messaging app. He scrolled past mundane texts about groceries and carpool schedules until he reached a name that made his heart pound: Calvin Merritt. The conversation thread began innocuously enough, filled with professional pleasantries and business jargon. But as he scrolled further, the tone shifted. "It was so nice seeing you tonight. You looked amazing." Graham froze, his grip on the phone tightening. He read the next message aloud, his voice barely a whisper. "Wish I didn't have to leave so soon." His chest burned as the words sank in, but it wasn't until he saw Juliet's reply that his vision blurred with anger. "You always know how to make me smile. Last night meant a lot to me, Calvin." Graham's knuckles turned white as he scrolled further, each message a dagger slicing deeper into his heart. The texts weren't graphic, but the intimacy was undeniable. A thread woven with flirtation and shared secrets, one he hadn't been part of. The conversation stretched back weeks, overlapping with moments he thought she'd been distant because of stress or exhaustion. He set the phone down, his breaths coming in shallow bursts. The evidence was there, plain as day, and it left no room for denial. Juliet had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. A faint sound broke his trance, the garage door creaking open. Juliet stepped inside, her arms full of grocery bags, her expression bright until she saw the phone on the table and the storm brewing in Graham's eyes. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice tentative. Graham didn't answer. Instead, he slid the phone across the table toward her. She glanced down, her face paling as she realized what he'd found. "Graham, Don't," he interrupted, his voice sharp and cold. "Don't lie to me. Not again." "It's not what it looks like," she started, but her voice faltered under his glare. "Then tell me what it is," he demanded, standing and towering over her. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've been playing me for a fool. How long, Juliet? How long have you been sneaking around behind my back?" Her eyes filled with tears, but he didn't relent. Every ounce of hurt and betrayal poured out of him, his voice trembling with barely restrained anger. "Do you even care what this is doing to me, to our family? Or is Calvin's attention worth more than the life we built together?" Juliet's lip quivered, and she set the groceries on the counter. "It wasn't supposed to happen this way," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Graham laughed bitterly, a hollow sound that filled the room. "That's your excuse? That it just happened? Like some accident you couldn't control?" Her silence was deafening, and for the first time she looked small, shrunken under the weight of her choices. "I thought we were in this together," Graham said, his voice breaking. "Through thick and thin, remember? That's what we promised each other. But I guess promises don't mean much to you anymore." Juliet's tears spilled over, but she didn't move to wipe them away. "I never wanted to hurt you," she said, her voice cracking. "I didn't mean for it to get this far." "But it did," he shot back, his tone cutting. "And now I don't know how to look at you without seeing this, without wondering if there's more you're not telling me." He turned away, his hands braced against the edge of the counter as he tried to steady himself. The weight of the betrayal was suffocating, threatening to crush him entirely. "Graham." Juliet's voice was soft, almost pleading, but he couldn't face her. "I need some air," he said abruptly, grabbing his jacket and heading for the door. As he stepped outside, the cool breeze did little to calm the fire raging within him. He didn't know what hurt more, the betrayal itself or the fact that part of him still wanted to believe in her, to believe that they could somehow fix what had been broken. But as he walked down the driveway, away from the home they had built together, one thing became painfully clear. Some wounds couldn't be mended. The papers sat on the kitchen table, stark and unyielding under the harsh glow of the overhead light. Graham stared at them, his jaw tight, his chest hollow. The words blurred together. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Juliet's name signed neatly at the bottom, the curves of her signature mocking him. She'd made her decision. The room was quiet except for the faint ticking of the wall clock. Outside, the world moved on as if his life hadn't just splintered into irreparable pieces. Graham ran a hand through his hair, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had known this was coming, felt it in every cold glance and defensive word. but seeing it in black and white made it real in a way he wasn't prepared for. Footsteps echoed down the hall, soft and hesitant. Juliet appeared in the doorway, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She didn't meet his eyes, instead focusing on a spot just past his shoulder. "I left them there because we need to move forward," she said softly, her voice steady but distant. "Move forward?" Graham's voice was sharp, cutting through the tension. "You mean tearing apart everything we've built?" Her lips tightened, and she stepped further into the room. "This isn't working, Graham. We've been broken for a long time, and you know it." "No, Juliet," he snapped, standing abruptly. "We had problems, like every marriage does. But this?" He gestured to the papers, his voice rising. "This is giving up. This is running away." Juliet flinched but held her ground. "Don't act like this is all on me. You've been distant for years, Graham. You buried yourself in work and left me here, alone, holding everything together." Graham's laugh was bitter, hollow. "Holding everything together? Is that what you call sneaking around with Calvin Merritt?" Her eyes flashed with anger, but she said nothing. That silence told him everything he needed to know. He sat back down, his head in his hands. "What about the kids, Juliet? What about Abigail, Rowan, Amelia? What do I tell them when they ask why their family is falling apart?" Her voice softened, but it didn't lose its edge. "We'll tell them the truth, that this is for the best, that we'll both be happier this way." "Happier?" Graham repeated, his voice breaking. "You think tearing this family apart is going to make anyone happy?" She hesitated, her resolve faltering. "It's better than staying in something that's already dead." The words hit him like a blow to the chest. He stood again, pacing the room as he tried to rein in the surge of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. Anger, heartbreak, betrayal. They all warred within him, leaving him raw and exposed. "I loved you," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I gave you everything I had, and it still wasn't enough." Juliet's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. "I loved you too, Graham. I still do. But not in the way I used to. Not in the way you deserve." The room fell silent again, the weight of her words suffocating. Graham sank back into his chair, his head bowed. He didn't know how to fight for something that was already slipping through his fingers. "Fine," he said at last, his voice heavy with defeat. "If this is what you want, I'll sign them. But don't you dare tell me this is for the best. Don't you dare pretend this isn't ripping us apart." Juliet nodded, her expression unreadable, and left the room. Graham stayed there long after she was gone, staring at the papers in front of him. His mind drifted to his children, Abigail with her bright smile, Rowan's endless questions, Amelia's laughter that could light up a room. How was he supposed to explain to them that their family was breaking because their parents had failed to hold it together? With shaking hands, he picked up the pen. Each stroke felt like a betrayal, not just of his marriage, but of everything he'd fought to protect. When he finished, he dropped the pen and leaned back, the sound of his own breathing loud in the stillness. The papers were signed. The decision was made. And yet, the ache in his chest told him this was only the beginning of the unraveling. The courthouse loomed ahead, its stone facade stark against the gray morning sky. Graham Stinson sat in his truck, staring at the building as the hum of the engine filled the silence. His palms were slick with sweat despite the cool air. This wasn't just a hearing, it was a battlefield, and he was walking into it alone. With a deep breath, he killed the engine and stepped out, his boots crunching against the gravel. Every step toward the courthouse felt heavier than the last. He clutched a file of documents tightly in one hand. Bank statements, property deeds, and copies of Juliet's texts with Calvin Merritt. Evidence, his lawyer had called it, a lifeline to hold on to. Inside, the air was cold and sterile. Graham's lawyer, Barbara Trent, stood near the entrance, her sharp features and dark blazer radiating confidence. She greeted him with a firm handshake. "You ready for this? Do I have a choice?" Graham muttered, his voice low and strained. Barbara offered a thin smile. "We fight. That's the choice." As they entered the courtroom, Juliet was already seated at the plaintiff's table. Her lawyer, a man with a perfectly pressed suit and a polished demeanor, leaned close, whispering something to her. She looked up, catching Graham's gaze for a brief moment before quickly looking away. He felt a pang of something, regret, maybe, or longing for the woman she used to be. But it was fleeting, swallowed by the raw sting of betrayal. The judge entered, and the proceedings began. Juliet's lawyer wasted no time painting her as a devoted mother, and Graham as an absent husband. "My client has been the backbone of this family," the lawyer declared, his voice smooth and persuasive. "While Mr. Stinson worked long hours, she managed the household, cared for the children, and supported his career. Now she seeks a fair division of assets and custody arrangements that prioritize the well-being of their 3 children." Graham's fists clenched under the table. The narrative felt like a knife twisting in his gut. It wasn't entirely untrue. He had worked long hours, but to frame him as distant, uncaring, that wasn't fair. Barbara stood, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. "Your Honor, we have evidence that contradicts this rosy portrayal. My client has dedicated himself to this family, financially, emotionally, and practically. The real issue at hand is Mrs. Stinson's recent actions, which have undermined this marriage." She handed the judge a folder, its contents stark against the polished wood of the bench. "Included are messages between Mrs. Stinson and Calvin Merritt, revealing an inappropriate relationship that has directly impacted the stability of this family." The room seemed to hold its breath as the judge flipped through the pages. Juliet's lawyer objected, claiming the texts were private and irrelevant. But Barbara countered with unyielding precision. "The texts demonstrate a breach of trust, Your Honor. They are central to understanding the breakdown of this marriage." Juliet shifted uncomfortably, her cheeks flushing as whispers rippled through the courtroom. Graham couldn't bring himself to look at her. His eyes remained fixed on the judge, willing the man to see the truth. When it was Graham's turn to testify, he spoke with quiet resolve. He recounted the nights spent building a life for his family, the sacrifices made for their home and future. His voice faltered only once, when he spoke of his children. "All I want is to be there for them," he said, his throat tightening, "to give them stability, love, and the father they deserve." Juliet's testimony followed, her voice trembling as she described feeling neglected and isolated. "I never wanted it to come to this," she said, glancing briefly at Graham, "but I can't undo what's already broken." The judge's decision came later that afternoon. Graham sat stiffly, his heart pounding as the words washed over him. Joint custody, but with primary residence awarded to Juliet. He would see the children on weekends and pay child support, a sum that felt less like a contribution and more like penance. As he left the courtroom, Barbara placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "This isn't over, Graham. You still have a voice. We'll make sure it's heard." But as he stepped into the parking lot, the weight of the ruling settled heavily on him. The battle wasn't just legal, it was personal. He had fought to protect his family, only to watch it slip further from his grasp. The wind bit at his face as he climbed into his truck, the courthouse growing smaller in the rearview mirror. He gripped the wheel tightly, his jaw set. If this was the price of truth, he would pay it. But he wouldn't stop fighting. Not for his children, not for himself. The house was quiet, eerily so. Graham stood in the middle of the living room staring at the empty space where the family photo used to hang. It had been Juliet's decision to take it down before the movers came, but somehow the blank wall was worse. It screamed of absence, of what had been and what would never return. He sank onto the worn leather couch, the one piece of furniture that hadn't been touched by the upheaval. His eyes drifted to the far corner where Amelia's toy box sat, now empty, its lid slightly ajar. The kids had left 2 days ago, and the silence since their departure had been deafening. Graham reached for the stack of papers on the coffee table, custody schedules, financial agreements, and notes from Barbara. He'd read them a dozen times, searching for some hidden clause, some overlooked detail that would make this all feel less final. But the words never changed. The first weekend visitation came faster than he expected. He cleaned the house from top to bottom, made their favorite snacks, and even bought new games to play. But when Abigail, Rowan, and Amelia arrived, it was clear they weren't the same kids he'd kissed goodbye months ago. Abigail barely spoke, her headphones a constant barrier between them. Rowan sat sullenly at the dining table picking at his food while Amelia clung to her stuffed bunny, refusing to leave her room. Graham tried to engage them, jokes, stories, even bribery with ice cream, but the chasm between them felt insurmountable. "Mom says you don't care about us," Rowan blurted one evening, his voice tinged with defiance. "She says you only care about your work." Graham froze, his heart sinking. "That's not true," he said quietly, kneeling beside his son. "I care about you more than anything." Rowan's eyes narrowed, his small fists clenched. "Then why aren't we together anymore? Why do you live here and we live there?" It was the question Graham had dreaded, the one he couldn't answer without unraveling. He reached for Rowan's hand, but the boy pulled away, his chair scraping loudly against the floor as he ran upstairs. That night, Graham sat in the darkened living room, the sound of the kids' soft snores barely reaching him from the hallway. He wondered if they'd ever understand the choices he'd made, if they'd ever forgive him for the ones he hadn't. Monday came too soon, and Juliet arrived to pick up the kids. She stood on the porch, her expression carefully neutral. "How were they?" she asked, her tone devoid of warmth. "They're adjusting," Graham replied, his voice thick. He hesitated, then added, "Do they know how much I love them?" Juliet's gaze softened, just for a moment. "They'll figure it out," she said before turning away, shepherding the kids into her car. As the days turned into weeks, Graham fell into a routine. He worked longer hours, finding solace in the rhythm of sanding wood and driving nails. But the emptiness always crept in when he returned home, a void that no amount of labor could fill. One night he found himself scrolling through old photos on his phone, stopping on one of Amelia in a princess dress, her face lit up with pure joy. His thumb hovered over the send button before he finally pressed it. "Thinking of you, kiddo. Love you always." The reply came hours later, a simple heart emoji. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make him smile. Months passed, and though the weekends with the kids remained strained, small moments of connection began to surface. Abigail shared a song she liked, Rowan asked for help with a science project, and Amelia let him braid her hair. They were small steps, fragile and tentative, but they gave him hope. Still, the weight of their separation lingered. Every time they left, Graham felt like he was losing them all over again. But he held on to one truth. He would never stop fighting for them. No matter how far they drifted, they would always be his. As he watched their taillights disappear down the driveway one Sunday evening, Graham whispered into the quiet, "We'll get through this. Somehow we will." The hardware store smelled of sawdust and metal, a mix Graham found strangely comforting. He was here to pick up a new blade for his circular saw, something to keep his hands busy and his mind distracted. Life had become a series of tasks to fill the silence, one errand, one repair job at a time. As he wandered through the aisles, his thoughts drifted to his kids. They hadn't called all week, and though he told himself they were just busy, the ache in his chest told a different story. He was pulling a blade off the shelf when a voice interrupted his spiraling thoughts. "Excuse me, could you help me for a second?" Graham turned, his gaze landing on a petite woman standing a few feet away. She held a car battery in her hands, the weight of it making her arms tremble slightly. Her auburn hair was tied back, a few loose strands framing her face. Despite the frustration in her tone, her hazel eyes carried a warmth that caught him off guard. "Sure," he said, stepping closer. "What do you need?" She gestured toward the chart on the wall, her brow furrowed. "I can't figure out which one of these goes with my car. It's a 2008 Civic, but none of the codes match up." Graham glanced at the chart and immediately spotted the issue. "You're looking at the wrong column," he said, pointing. "It's this one here. You'll need the 24F. She sighed in relief, a smile breaking through her earlier frustration. "Thank you. I've been staring at that thing for 10 minutes. "No problem," he replied, taking the battery from her hands. "Let me carry this for you. Where's your car?" Her smile faltered slightly, her cheeks flushing. "It's not here. It broke down at the park. I was planning to walk back with this." Graham raised an eyebrow. "You were going to carry this all the way to the park?" "Didn't have much of a choice," she said with a shrug. It's either this or wait 3 hours for roadside assistance. He hesitated for only a moment before nodding. Let me give you a ride. I've got tools in the truck. I can help you get it installed. She blinked, clearly surprised. Are you sure? I mean, you don't even know me. He smiled, the first genuine one he'd managed in weeks. It's not a big deal. Besides, I'm pretty sure you're not planning to rob me over a car battery. A laugh escaped her, light and genuine. All right. You win. Thank you, really. As they drove to the park, she introduced herself. I'm Celeste, by the way. Celeste Whitmore. Graham, he replied. Nice to meet you. The conversation flowed easily, surprising them both. She told him about her job as an elementary school teacher and how she'd moved to Somerset Valley only a year ago. He found himself talking more than he intended, sharing bits about his work and his kids. There was something about her presence, calm, grounded, that made it easy to open up. When they arrived, her car was parked under a tree, its hood propped open. Graham wasted no time installing the new battery, his hands moving with practiced ease. Celeste stood nearby, watching with a mix of curiosity and gratitude. You're good at this, she said after a while. Do you fix everything yourself? Pretty much, he replied. It's what I do for a living. Building, repairing, keeps me busy. She nodded, her gaze lingering on him a moment longer than necessary. Well, thank you, Graham. I don't know how I would have managed without your help. He wiped his hands on a rag and glanced at her, a slight smile tugging at his lips. Any time. For the first time in months, the heaviness in his chest lifted, if only slightly. As Celeste drove away, her hand waving out the window, Graham stood there for a moment, watching until her car disappeared down the road. He didn't know it yet, but this chance meeting would mark the beginning of something new, something he hadn't dared to hope for. The early morning sun painted the sky in soft hues of orange and pink as Graham parked his truck outside the small fixer-upper on Oak Street. It was the kind of house most people wouldn't give a second glance, peeling paint, sagging porch, and a yard overtaken by weeds. But to Graham, it was an opportunity, a blank slate, and now it was a shared project. Celeste arrived moments later, stepping out of her car with a coffee in hand and a canvas tote slung over her shoulder. Her hair was tied back in a loose braid, and her smile was as bright as the sunrise. Graham couldn't help but notice the way her presence seemed to lighten the air around her. This is the place? She asked, tilting her head as she surveyed the house. This is it, Graham replied, his tone tinged with both pride and trepidation. She's got good bones, just needs a lot of love. Celeste grinned. Good thing I've got plenty of that to give. They started with the porch, stripping away the rotted wood and replacing it with fresh planks. Celeste insisted on helping, even after Graham warned her about splinters and sore muscles. She laughed at his caution, rolling up her sleeves and proving she wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty. As they worked, their conversations flowed effortlessly. Celeste shared stories about her students, funny, heartwarming moments that painted a picture of her unwavering dedication. Graham found himself opening up in return, recounting memories of his kids before the divorce. His voice softened when he spoke of them, the pain of their absence evident in every word. They'll come around, Celeste said gently, pausing to meet his gaze. Kids are resilient, Graham. They just need time. Her words lingered, a balm to the ache he carried. For the first time in a long while, he felt the faint stirrings of hope. By midday, the porch was complete, and they sat side by side on the steps, sharing sandwiches and laughing about the streaks of paint on Celeste's cheek. The laughter felt foreign to Graham, but it was welcome, like a warm breeze cutting through a long winter. Over the next few weeks, the house began to transform. Celeste became a regular fixture at the site, her enthusiasm infectious. She had a knack for picking colors and details Graham would have never considered, and her touch brought a vibrancy to the space he hadn't realized it was missing. One evening, as they stood in the newly painted living room, Graham turned to her, his voice quiet. Why are you doing this, Celeste? Helping me with all of this? She looked at him, her hazel eyes unwavering. Because I believe in second chances, she said simply. For houses, for people. Her words hit him like a wave, and for a moment he couldn't speak. He was used to being the one who fixed things, who held the pieces together. But Celeste had a way of making him feel like it was okay to let someone else carry the weight for a while. The project continued, and with each passing day, Graham began to notice a change in himself. The bitterness that had clung to him since the divorce started to loosen its grip. He found himself looking forward to the mornings, to the laughter and shared effort that came with rebuilding not just the house, but something inside him. One afternoon, as they planted flowers in the front yard, Celeste paused, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You know, this house reminds me of you." Graham raised an eyebrow. "Falling apart and full of holes?" She laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "No, sturdy, strong, worth saving." Her words stayed with him long after she left that evening. As he stood on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, he realized something he hadn't dared to admit before. Celeste wasn't just helping him rebuild a house, she was helping him rebuild himself. The sound of laughter filled the kitchen, mingling with the faint sizzle of bacon on the stove. Graham glanced over his shoulder, watching as Celeste helped Amelia stir pancake batter at the counter. The sight was so ordinary, yet it struck him with an unfamiliar warmth. This fleeting moment of joy was something he hadn't felt in years. "Don't stir too fast," Celeste said, her voice patient. "We don't want the batter to fly everywhere." Amelia giggled, her small hands gripping the whisk tightly. "Like last time?" Celeste grinned. "Exactly like last time." Graham couldn't help but smile. He hadn't planned on introducing Celeste to his kids so soon, but she had insisted on helping him make their weekend visit special. And, to his surprise, the kids had warmed to her quickly, especially Amelia, who seemed to hang on her every word. Rowan, however, was less forthcoming. He sat at the table, his arms crossed, watching the scene with a guarded expression. Graham could see the questions in his eyes, the doubts and hesitations he hadn't yet voiced. "Pancakes almost ready, bud?" Graham asked, trying to draw him out. Rowan shrugged. "Guess so." Celeste turned, catching the tension in the boy's voice. She wiped her hands on a towel and approached the table, crouching slightly to meet his eye level. "Hey, Rowan, do you want to help me flip the pancakes? I hear it's a very important job." Rowan hesitated, his gaze flickering between her and his father. Finally he nodded, standing slowly. Celeste beamed, leading him to the stove. Graham watched as she handed Rowan the spatula, her tone encouraging as she guided him through the motions. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The rest of the day passed in a blur of small victories and tender moments. They played board games in the living room, built a fort out of couch cushions, and ended the evening with a movie. For the first time in what felt like forever, Graham allowed himself to believe that things might be okay. But happiness, he knew, was a fragile thing. Later that night, after the kids had gone to bed, Graham and Celeste sat on the porch, a comfortable silence settling between them. The air was cool, the stars bright against the dark sky. Celeste sipped her tea, her gaze thoughtful. "They're good kids," she said softly. "You've done a great job with them, Graham." He shook his head, a bitter smile tugging at his lips. "I don't know about that. I've let them down more times than I can count." "You're here," she replied firmly. "That's what matters." He looked at her, the sincerity in her voice cutting through his doubt. "How do you do that?" he asked quietly. "Make everything seem so simple?" Celeste chuckled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "It's not simple. It's messy and complicated, but I've learned that the only way to move forward is to focus on the good moments, the ones that make it all worth it." Her words lingered in the air, and Graham felt something shift within him. For the first time, he wondered if he could let go of the guilt and pain that had weighed him down for so long. If he could embrace the possibility of happiness, even if it felt fragile. But life, as always, had its own plans. The next morning, as Graham was packing the kids' things, his phone buzzed with a message from Juliet. The words were sharp and pointed, a reminder of the custody agreement he'd been trying so hard to navigate. "Rowan told me about your friend." "Be careful who you bring around my kids." Graham's jaw tightened as he read the message, anger bubbling beneath the surface. He hadn't done anything wrong, hadn't introduced Celeste lightly, but Juliet's tone carried an accusation he couldn't ignore. "What's wrong?" Celeste asked, sensing his shift in mood. He sighed, holding up the phone. Juliet, she's upset about you being here. Celeste frowned, but her voice remained calm. Do you want me to leave before she picks them up? No, Graham said firmly. You don't have to go anywhere. This is my time with the kids, and I won't let her dictate how we spend it. Celeste nodded, her hand brushing lightly against his arm. I'm here for you, Graham. Whatever you need. As Juliet's car pulled into the driveway later that day, Graham steeled himself for the confrontation he knew was coming. But as the kids hugged him goodbye, their smiles bright and unguarded, he held on to the hope that, despite the challenges, they were building something worth fighting for. The rain tapped softly against the truck's windshield as Graham sat in the parking lot of Rowan's middle school. His stomach churned with a mix of hope and dread. It had been months since their last meaningful conversation, and every attempt to bridge the growing divide felt like stepping into quicksand. But he couldn't give up. Not now. Rowan emerged from the building, his backpack slung over one shoulder, his face a mask of teenage indifference. Graham rolled down the window and called out, Hey, kiddo, ready to grab some burgers? Rowan hesitated before nodding, climbing into the truck without a word. The silence stretched between them as Graham navigated the familiar streets toward their favorite diner. He glanced at his son, searching for a crack in the armor he seemed to wear every time they were together. But Rowan stared straight ahead, his expression unreadable. At the diner, they slid into a booth, and Graham ordered their usual. A double cheeseburger for Rowan and a BLT for himself. As they waited for their food, he tried to fill the silence with small talk. How's school? You still liking science class? Rowan shrugged. It's fine. And basketball? You still playing? Another shrug. I guess. Graham sighed, leaning back in his seat. You know, you don't have to give me the one-word treatment, Rowan. I'm trying here. Rowan looked up, his eyes narrowing. Trying? Is that what you call it? The word stung, but Graham kept his tone steady. Yeah, it is. I know things haven't been easy, but I'm doing my best to be here for you. Being here now doesn't make up for not being there before, Rowan shot back, his voice rising. You were always working, Dad, always gone. And then you left us. You left me. Graham's chest tightened. I didn't leave you, Rowan. I never wanted to leave any of you. Rowan's gaze dropped to the table, his fingers picking at the edge of his napkin. Then why does it feel like you did? The question hung in the air, raw and heavy. Graham leaned forward, his voice soft but firm. Because I messed up. I should have done more, been more present. I thought working hard and providing for the family was enough, but I see now that it wasn't. And I'm sorry, Rowan. I'm so sorry. For a moment, Rowan didn't respond. Then he looked up, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. Why did you have to leave Mom? Why couldn't you just fix things? Graham's breath hitched, and he searched for the right words. Sometimes people hurt each other in ways that can't be undone. I tried to fix things, but it wasn't enough. And I know that's hard to understand, but I need you to know it was never about you or your sisters. My love for you hasn't changed. Not then. Not now. Rowan wiped at his eyes with the back of his hand, his voice barely above a whisper. It doesn't feel like love when you're not there. Their food arrived, and the waitress gave them a sympathetic smile before retreating. Graham let the silence settle for a moment before speaking again. You're right, Rowan. I wasn't there the way I should have been, but I'm here now and I'm not going anywhere. You don't have to forgive me overnight, but I need you to know that I'm not giving up on us. Rowan stared at his burger, his jaw tight. Then, slowly, he nodded. Okay, he said quietly, but you have to try harder. Graham's heart ached with a mix of guilt and relief. I will, he promised. I'll do better, I swear. The drive home was quieter, but the tension had lessened. When they pulled into the driveway, Rowan paused before getting out of the truck. Thanks for the burger, Dad. You're welcome, bud, Graham said, his voice thick with emotion. I'll see you next weekend. Rowan nodded, then disappeared into the house. Graham watched him go, a flicker of hope igniting in his chest. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start, and sometimes a start was enough. The letter sat on Graham's nightstand, untouched for days. It had arrived with Juliet's name scrawled across the envelope, her handwriting slightly slanted as though written in haste. He had read the first line before setting it down, unable to face the flood of emotions it threatened to unleash. Now, as the house sat in stillness, Graham found himself drawn to it once more. The kids were asleep, their laughter still echoing faintly in the quiet. Celeste had left earlier with a soft kiss on his cheek, telling him to take the time he needed. Alone now, with the night pressing in around him, Graham picked up the letter and opened it. The words spilled out like a river of regret. "Graham, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but if you do, I need you to hear me. I'm sorry for everything. For the lies, for the hurt, for tearing apart what we built together. I never wanted to be the person who caused you pain, but I became her anyway. I see that now." He stopped, his breath catching. The knot in his chest tightened as he continued. "I told myself that I was lonely, that I was justified in seeking comfort elsewhere. But the truth is, I was scared of not being enough, of not feeling seen. And instead of facing those fears, I ran. I hurt you in ways I can't undo. I see it in Rowan's eyes when he talks about you, in the distance Abigail tries to keep between us, in Amelia's questions I don't know how to answer. You were always the anchor in this family, Graham. I just didn't realize it until it was too late." Graham's hand shook as he folded the letter shut. He couldn't read anymore. Not yet. The weight of Juliet's words bore down on him, dragging him back to the night spent wondering where things had gone wrong. Her admission of fear mirrored his own, a shared vulnerability they had never voiced. He rose from the bed, pacing the room. Memories of their life together resurfaced unbidden, good moments mixed with the bad. The day they brought Abigail home from the hospital, Juliet's laughter filling the air as Graham fumbled with the car seat. The quiet arguments in the kitchen when the bills piled up, their voices hushed so the kids wouldn't hear. The way she'd hold his hand in the dark when she thought he was asleep, as though grounding herself to him. Forgiveness was a word that felt heavy, almost impossible. But as Graham stood there, staring out the window at the moonlit yard, he realized it wasn't about letting Juliet off the hook. It was about letting himself go, letting go of the bitterness that had taken root in his heart, letting go of the anger that had tethered him to the past. The next morning, he called Juliet. The line rang longer than expected before she answered, her voice cautious. "Graham?" "I got your letter," he said, his tone measured. "I've been thinking about it." A pause. Then, "And?" "I'm still hurt, Juliet. I don't think that'll ever fully go away. But I can't keep carrying this anger around. It's not good for me. It's not good for the kids. So, I forgive you." The words felt foreign on his tongue, but they carried a strange sense of release. He heard her breath hitch on the other end. "Thank you," she said softly. "I don't deserve it, but thank you." "I'm not doing it for you," he admitted. "I'm doing it for them, and for me." They spoke a little longer, nothing deep, just logistical plans for the kids. When he hung up, Graham felt lighter, not entirely healed, but on his way. That evening, as he sat on the porch with Celeste, the sunset painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, she reached for his hand. "You seem different tonight," she said, her voice gentle. "I think I finally let something go," he replied, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "It's not perfect, but it's a start." Celeste leaned her head against his shoulder, her presence a quiet reminder of the life he was rebuilding. And for the first time in years, Graham felt like he could look forward instead of back. The hospital room was filled with a silence Graham had grown to understand. It wasn't the oppressive kind that made your ears ring. It was the kind that held weight, a quiet reminder of the fragility of life. Machines hummed softly, their rhythmic beeping the only indication of time moving forward. Graham sat beside the bed, his hand resting gently over Celeste's, her fingers cool beneath his touch. The years had brought them joy, laughter, and a love that healed wounds neither of them thought could mend. Together they had weathered storms, celebrated milestones, and built a life that felt solid and true. But even love, as powerful as it was, could not hold back time. Celeste stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open to meet his. They were softer now, etched with the lines of a life well lived, but they still carried the spark that had drawn him to her all those years ago. She smiled faintly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're still here." "Always," Graham replied, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "I told you I'm not going anywhere." She sighed, her chest rising and falling with effort. "You've been my rock, you know that? Even when I tried to push you away." Graham chuckled lightly, brushing a strand of her silver hair from her face. "And you've been my light. Every time I thought I couldn't go on, you were there to remind me why I had to." Tears welled in her eyes, but they didn't fall. "I'm so glad we found each other. I don't know what I would have done without you." He squeezed her hand gently, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "We were meant to find each other, Celeste. You saved me as much as I saved you." The room fell silent again, their unspoken words filling the space between them. Graham's mind drifted to memories of their life together, their first shared meal on a rickety porch, the way her laughter filled their home, the nights spent talking about nothing and everything. Those moments were treasures etched into his heart. A soft knock on the door broke his reverie, and Amelia stepped inside, her presence a comforting anchor. She had grown into a strong, compassionate woman, her hazel eyes mirroring her mother's. Behind her stood Rowan and Abigail, their expressions a mix of sorrow and strength. "Hi, Mom," Amelia said softly, leaning down to kiss Celeste's forehead. "We're all here." Celeste's eyes brightened at the sight of her children. "My beautiful babies," she murmured, her voice trembling. "I'm so proud of all of you." Abigail took her hand, while Rowan pulled up a chair, his quiet strength evident in the way he sat close to her, offering his silent support. They shared stories, laughed softly, and held on to the fleeting moments as though they could stretch them forever. As the night wore on, Celeste's breaths grew slower, her voice fading into a whisper. Graham never let go of her hand, his grip firm yet gentle. When the time came, her passing was peaceful, a quiet exhale that seemed to take the weight of the world with it. The funeral was small and intimate, held under the sprawling oak tree in the backyard where she had once planted flowers with Amelia. Graham stood beside her grave, the words he wanted to say catching in his throat. Instead, he simply whispered, "Thank you for everything. I'll see you again." The years that followed were not easy, but Graham carried Celeste's love with him in everything he did. He found solace in the memories they had shared, and in the laughter of his grandchildren, who carried pieces of her spirit in their bright eyes. One crisp autumn evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Graham sat on the porch of their home, the rocking chair creaking softly beneath him. He closed his eyes, the cool breeze brushing against his face, and in the stillness he felt her, Celeste's warmth, her light, wrapping around him like a promise. He smiled, his heart full. He would join her soon, he knew, and when that day came, it wouldn't be the end. It would be a reunion, eternal and unbroken. What do you think of Graham's journey and his path to forgiveness and love? From which region are you watching this video? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to follow all our stories. And make sure to check out more heartwarming tales by clicking here on the end screen. Thank you for watching.